So the report coming out is that the Steelers and the Lions could potentially come together on a defensive back trade, and the two names that were brought up were Asante Samuel Jr. and Brandon Eccles. And honestly, I understand why this is even a conversation, because Detroit is sitting there with the real questions in the secondary. Pittsburgh has more defensive backs than people probably expected them to have. And when you get close to training camp, this is exactly when teams start looking around the league like, all right, who has too many guys at one spot? Who might be willing to move somebody? Who has a veteran or a young corner that could help us right now? So, from that standpoint, I get the logic of the report. The Lions might be interested. They might be more than interested. They might be getting to the point where they are desperate enough to call Pittsburgh and actually put something real on the table. But my stance on this is pretty simple. I would not be in a rush to trade Asante Samuel Jr. I know people hear trade rumors and immediately start thinking about picks, value, flipping depth, making the smart business move, and I understand all of that. But Samuel is the exact type of player I would want to hold on to unless the offer is strong enough that you almost feel stupid turning it down. He is not just some random camp body who got thrown into the conversation because the Steelers have numbers at corner. He's a real defensive back with real ball skills. He has played meaningful football, and if he is healthy and comfortable in this defense, that is not somebody I am tossing away just because another team has problems. Brandon Eccles is the one I would be more open to moving, and even with him, I'm not giving him away for some late pick just to say the Steelers made a trade. If Detroit wants help, cool, Pittsburgh should listen, but listening and helping another team fix its roster are two completely different things. The Steelers are finally in a position where they have depth in the secondary, and now the conversation should not be how fast can we get rid of it. The conversation should be how much are you willing to pay us to take away from one of the deepest parts of our roster. That is the difference. And with this roster, that is where Omar Khan has to be patient, because being aggressive does not always mean forcing the move. Sometimes the aggressive play is making the other team chase you, especially when they are the team with the hole and you are the team with the depth. I am not against the idea of using depth as a weapon. That is what smart teams do. If you have a crowded room and another team is short, you pick up the phone, you hear the offer, and you see whether the value makes sense. But with Samuel specifically, I would need a good pick. Not a fake good pick, not some conditional seventh that turns into a sixth if he plays 70% of the snaps, not some throwaway move that only sounds useful because fans like the word asset. I mean real draft capital. Because if Asante Samuel Jr. looks good in camp, if he is moving well, if he looks like the player people thought he could be before the injury stuff, then now you are not trading a spare piece. You are trading a guy who could help you win games when injuries hit, when matchups get weird, when you need another defensive back who can actually cover. And in today's NFL, that is valuable. So yeah, the report makes sense. The Lions make sense as a team that would call. The Steelers make sense as a team that would have names other teams ask about. But the answer should not be yes, just because somebody asked. If Detroit wants Brandon Eccles and the price is solid, I can have that conversation. If Detroit wants Asante Samuel Jr., now we are talking about a much different level of compensation, because that is the type of move where Pittsburgh better walk away with something that actually helps the future of the team. The part of this that people cannot overlook is how much Patrick Graham's defense is going to lean on defensive backs, because this is not some old school defense where you line up in base all day, roll out two corners, two safeties, and act like depth is a luxury. That is not the league anymore, and that is not the way this defense is being built. Patrick Graham runs a lot of nickel looks. He wants flexibility. He wants defensive backs who can communicate, tackle, disguise, rotate, travel, pass things off, and survive when offenses start spreading you out. That means your third corner is not really a backup. Your fourth corner is not some guy you only think about when disaster hits. Your safeties, your nickel, your dime packages, your matchup pieces, all of that becomes part of the identity of the defense. So when people say, well, Pittsburgh has enough defensive backs, just trade one, I think that is too simple. Enough according to who? Enough in July is not always enough in October. Enough before camp is not always enough after the first two preseason games. The Steelers have watched seasons get weird because one injury turns a strength into a weakness overnight, and especially in this division where you are dealing with quarterbacks who can extend plays, receivers who can win one-on-one, tight ends who can stress the middle of the field, and offenses that will force you into heavier defensive back usage. You better have more than just a starting lineup. You need answers behind the answers. That is why I would be careful with Samuel. That is why I would be careful even with Eccles, because the moment you move one of these guys, the depth chart looks cleaner on paper, but the margin for error gets smaller. And if Patrick Graham is really going to run this defense the way it sounds like he is going to run it, The Steelers are going to need defensive backs who can play different roles, not just names filling out a roster sheet. You need guys who can step into nickel looks. You need guys who can play outside if somebody tweaks a hamstring. You need guys who can rotate in certain packages and not get hunted immediately by opposing quarterbacks. And that is where Asante Samuel Jr. becomes interesting. Because if he is right physically, he gives you a skill set that is not easy to replace. He has instincts. He has anticipation. He can play the football. He is not the biggest corner in the world, but not every corner has to look like a created player on Madden. Some guys win because they know what they are seeing before the ball comes out, and that is a huge part of surviving in a DB-heavy defense. Echols is different, but he has value too, because he has shown he can be reliable when called upon, and reliable depth is not boring when you actually need it. That is the thing fans forget. Everybody loves the shiny name in July, but the season is won with the guys who can hold the rope when your starters are banged up, when your top corner needs a breather, when a matchup forces you into a package you did not expect to use so much. So I am not sitting here saying the Steelers should never trade from the secondary. That would be unrealistic. If Dalen Everett comes in and really starts playing well, if he looks comfortable, if he is not just surviving reps but actually earning trust, then okay, now the Steelers have more flexibility. That changes the math. But Dalen Everett performing well should give Pittsburgh leverage, not make them careless. There's a difference between having options and acting like depth does not matter. The Steelers finally have a secondary room where there are multiple players worth discussing, and that is a good problem. But good problems only stay good if you handle them right. You do not take a position that is built on rotation, matchup versatility, and injury protection and start stripping it down for low-level value. If Detroit wants to overpay, now we are talking. If not, keep the depth and let Patrick Graham use it. This is where the front office has to be disciplined, because there is a version of this trade idea that makes a lot of sense, and there is also a version of it that would annoy me immediately. If the Lions are calling because they have a real need and they view Pittsburgh as one of the few teams with extra defensive backs, then Omar Khan should absolutely pick up the phone. There is nothing wrong with that. That is good business. You let Detroit explain how badly they want one of these guys. You let them show their hand a little bit, and then you decide whether the value is strong enough to even keep the conversation alive. But the Steelers cannot treat Asante Samuel Jr. and Brandon Echols like the same level of trade chip. They are not the same conversation to me. Echols is the name where I can see it a little easier. If Detroit wants a dependable corner, Pittsburgh likes what it has behind him, Dalen Everett is pushing faster than expected, and the return is actually worth it, then fine. That is the type of move that can make sense. You get a pick, you clear up the room, you reward the fact that you built enough depth to have options, and you keep moving. But Samuel is different. Samuel is the one where I would hate it unless the pick coming back is legitimately strong, and the reason is not complicated. If he plays well this year, you are talking about a short-term contract player who could give you real snaps and then potentially have real market value anyway. So if another team wants to jump the line and take that upside from you right now, they should have to pay for it. Not politely pay for it, not here's a little something because we know you have a crowded room. No, pay for the fact that Pittsburgh would be giving up a defensive back who could become a major part of this secondary if everything clicks. That is why I would not be a fan of moving him. But I can admit the one scenario where it makes football sense: if Samuel is balling in camp, if the Steelers feel like he is healthy, if the rest of the room is holding up, if Everett is making the coaches believe he can play early, and then Detroit comes in with a high enough pick, you at least have to consider it. That does not mean you love it. It does not mean you run to accept it. It means you are honest about the roster, the contract, the value, and the future, because the Steelers cannot fall in love with every player to the point where they ignore a good deal, but they also cannot be so obsessed with flipping pieces that they weaken a defense that is supposed to be the backbone of this team. That is the balance. And for me, the price on Samuel would be high, very high. If Detroit is desperate, then act like they are desperate. Make them prove it. Make them give you something that makes fans at least pause before they complain. Because I am telling you right now, if the Steelers trade Samuel for some weak return, and then two corners get banged up in September, everybody's going to look back at this exact conversation and wonder why Pittsburgh got cute. But if they get a strong pick, if they trust Everett, if Patrick Graham feels like he still has enough defensive back depth to run the nickel packages the way he wants, then okay, I can understand the business side of it. I still would not like losing Samuel. I'm a fan of the player. I like the fit. I like the upside. I like having that extra cover guy in a league where you are basically never done needing corners. But there is a number where every conversation changes. So my final take is this. The report might be true. The Lions might absolutely be interested, and the Steelers should be willing to listen. But listening does not mean selling cheap. Brandon Eccles is the easier name to move if the value is right. Asante Samuel Jr. should only be moved if Detroit gives you a pick that actually feels like a win. Anything less than that, keep the depth. Let Patrick Graham build this secondary the way he wants, and do not help another contender solve its problem unless they are paying premium prices.